During World War II, this was one of the most secret and dangerous places on Earth. In this dense and mosquito-ridden forest in a remote part of Poland, engineers created Hitler's main wartime headquarters, known as Wolfschanze, the Wolf Slayer. It was here that Hitler came closest to death, the target of a daring assassination plot by members of his own military. It was the culmination of a dozen known attempts on his life. This is the story of those heroic individuals who tried to change the course of history. It is also the story, revealed here for the first time, of a top-secret plot hatched in London to kill the most hated man on Earth. For 12 years, Hitler held Germany in an iron grip. Hitler promised Germans work, bread, and good order, and had delivered. In return, he received fanatical devotion. But there were those who saw his true intentions and plotted to remove him.
From the moment of Hitler's appointment, the National Socialists made certain that they would never have to relinquish power again. In other words, they established a police state.
The Nazis had secured their power in Germany mainly by having all the town areas carefully organized with a party member in every block of flats, keeping an eye on exactly what was going on. In every village, there was at least one party narc, probably two, keeping an eye on how people were behaving.
It is a very difficult situation in a dictatorship to be against a dictatorship. What can you do? That's the big question. That's the big question that hangs over the German resistance. Of course, try and kill Hitler, says everybody. But if you cannot do that, what do you do then?
In 1938, in September, when war threatened to break out, the Germans recoiled at the prospect of another war. But they had no way of expressing their dissatisfaction. They could not publish anything, they could not speak out, they could not use the radio, they could not use a free press. There was no free press.
Nonetheless, resistance grew. Freya von Moltke's husband Helmut, a lawyer and aristocrat, formed a secret group that met in this home in Berlin. The Kreisau Circle worked on plans for a new democratic Germany, but were divided on the issue of Hitler's removal from office.
There are all those who said, the quicker he's dead, the better. Think of all the victims that we can save. But Helmut said, to the eyes of the Germans, Hitler must destroy himself. Let Hitler kill himself, so to speak.
The other principal group of opposition to Hitler formed around Karl Gödler, the mayor of Leipzig, who tried to civilize the Nazis by working with them and failed. He believed Hitler should be put on trial.
As a lawyer, he imagined if a trial were to follow Hitler's arrest, then in the course of this trial, all the awful things that had happened under Hitler's regime would be exposed to the German people. And that would free the people from the illusion that Hitler was a great leader.
The first group to plot Hitler's death met in this Berlin building, the headquarters of the Abwehr, Germany's intelligence organization. Their leader was General Hans Oster. He detested Hitler, his treatment of the Jews, and his warlike intentions. In September 1938, he organized a commando group to burst into Hitler's office in Berlin and murder him. It was an audacious plan.
It was an enormous step to take. You just have to appreciate that some people said, I just can't do it. On top of that, there was a question of murder, which was a problem for everybody. But as a Christian, you know that you live by forgiveness, and we all commit sins in the course of our lives. And my father knew that, and was always prepared to act, even if it meant murder.
The Oster plan collapsed when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain came to Munich in late September 1938 and signed an accord guaranteeing, it seemed, peace in Europe. Hitler was to swiftly break that agreement, but for Oster and his group, their opportunity to kill Hitler had withered with the signing of the peace accord. In London, the British government had received several approaches from the German resistance prior to the war, warning them of Hitler's warlike intentions and seeking their help. They were rebuffed.
It was pretty clear that the extent of the Nazi organization was so rigorous that the only organization that would have been competent to destroy the Nazis was, in fact, the German army, the Wehrmacht. And of course, they were on the crest of these military successes.
Hitler's early military successes endeared most of the army to him. His senior generals had particular reason to remain loyal.
Hitler certainly tried to bribe them and to buy them, and I would say with some measure of success. Some received large estates of thousands of acres, and some received enormous gifts of up to 1 million marks on their birthdays or on some more or less contrived occasion, and they accepted these. One can hardly expect people who accept money from Hitler to kill him.
It fell to this man, the least likely of assassins, to make one of the most important attempts on Hitler's life. George Elser was a cabinet maker from the small mountain village of Königsbronn, 100 miles west of Munich. At school, he had been a model pupil. For a short time, he was employed in the local steel works. He showed no interest in politics, Hitler, or the Nazis. His great love was music. He sang in the local choir and played several musical instruments, including the double bass and the zither. 13-year-old Hans Elser, a distant cousin, sang and played alongside him.
Da war ein Klostergebäude, Torbogengebäude, musiziert.
We used to make music in an old monastery. He played double bass, my father played the cello. I played the violin. My violin teacher also joined in. And that's how we developed a close relationship. And my parents were very enthusiastic about Johann Georg Else, and he became a friend of the family, so to speak. He was very obliging, but modest and retiring.
Aber immer bescheiden, zurückhaltend gewesen.
Elser planned his assassination with military precision. He began to build his bomb with explosives and detonators stolen from this local quarry. In August 1939, he left Königsbronn and took a train to Munich. Renting a room at 94 Türkenstrasse, he spent the day designing and perfecting his bomb. Each evening, he left his lodgings to take supper at the Bürgerbrau beer hall, his chosen assassination site. He knew each November the Nazi Party honored its fallen heroes in a ceremony Hitler was sure to attend. Its climax was Hitler's address to the party faithful at the Bürgerbrau Keller.
It was possible for Georg Elser to hide himself for 6 weeks running every night in that beer hall and to install an infernal machine in a pillar behind the rostrum on which Hitler spoke when he addressed the assembly.
Elser's bomb went off right on cue at 9:20 p.m. on November 8, 1938, killing 8 people and injuring 63. It missed Hitler by 13 minutes.
Unfortunately for Elser, Hitler wanted to be in Berlin the next morning. Therefore, Hitler had to cut short his customary 2 to 2.5 hour speech to about 1 hour and catch his train out of Munich.
Wir hatten die Tatsache, dass Johann Georg Elser dieses Attentat auf Hitler.
We found out from the newspaper that Georg Elser had carried out this assassination attempt against Hitler. We knew there had been an assassination attempt, but when we found out that it had been carried out by Georg Elser, we just could not believe it. Nobody in Königsbronn would have believed that he was capable of it. That was perhaps because he had never expressed any political views. As far as we were concerned, we knew nothing about his political opinions. his attitude.
Nicht bekannt war, seine Einstellung.
Hitler was shocked by his close encounter with death, and his security was tightened. He believed Elser had received help from British intelligence. He was made a personal prisoner of the Führer and placed in solitary confinement. A show trial was planned for the end of the war, when Elser would face charges with his criminal British associates. Hitler was wrong. Elser's gallant attempt had received no help from the British, but it was not long before they too were drawing up their own plan to kill the Führer. George Elser's bomb came within a heartbeat of ending Hitler's life, but Hitler put his own interpretation on his survival.
He would point out that this was a miracle, and it was a very clear signal from Providence. He did not refer to God, but he said Providence, that he must continue as he had. In his view, he was the only one who could fulfill the call of destiny to kill the Jews, to gain the Lebensraum, a living space for Germany in the East. Therefore, he had to conserve his life.
Knowing where Hitler was at any given time and gaining access to his presence were the two greatest problems facing any would-be assassin. There were the potential assassination sites, his 9-room apartment in Munich, which he used regularly from 1929 until the end of the war. There was the Reichschancellery in Berlin, Hitler's seat of government, and where he had his apartment and main office. There was Hitler's military headquarters, the Wolfslayer in East Prussia, with its heavy fortifications. And in the Bavarian Alps near Berchtesgaden, there was Hitler's hideaway, his villa, the Berghof.
For a period of about 20 years, from 1923 through 1944, Hitler was here on this mountain for a minimum of 2 months of each year, transforming it into a southern headquarters for the Nazi Party.
Hitler loved the Berghof. There he was relaxed and accessible, but the vigilance of those around him never failed.
In those days, it was certainly possible to carry a pistol into Hitler's presence if it was someone carrying the pistol whom Hitler trusted or whom Hitler didn't suspect. But if someone was suspected, then of course he would be very closely watched, so that people found their wrist was grabbed as they reached into their pockets for a handkerchief. And it would have been probably impossible for someone to pull out a pistol, take aim, and make a fatal shot before their hand or arm would have been knocked up or down by one of the adjutants. And of course the shot had to be fatal because there wouldn't be a second one.
The bodyguards closest to the Führer were the SS Begleitkommando. Rochus Meach was a member of that elite group for 5 years.
Wir waren etwa 20.
There were about 20 of us that had the task of protecting Hitler. We were the innermost circle, his last line of defense. Everywhere Hitler went, we went too. Whether it was in the Führer's apartment in the Reichschancellery, whether it was at the Berghof in Berchtesgaden, all headquarters, no matter where, even if the headquarters was on the train when we were traveling. We were on the train too, and our carriage was the one always next to Hitler's. And when we were on the move, we were always with him. Whether it was in a car, it didn't matter. We were his bodyguards.
Dazu waren wir Bodyguard.
Once Hitler left the security of his home, the risk of assassination increased. But consideration had been given to his safety. His Mercedes was armor-plated, its windows were bulletproof, the tires were of special construction, each had 20 chambers. If a bullet hit one of those chambers, the tires remained inflated and the car would continue to accelerate. The vehicle was supercharged and could outpace pursuers with ease. Hitler made many of his intercity journeys by rail, but again, his personal security had been very carefully considered.
He was very well protected. First of all, he had his own train on which no one traveled except himself and his adjutants and perhaps his cook or anyone he wanted to come along. Secondly, when he used his train, the district directors of the railway were required to ride a locomotive in front of the train at a distance of about 10 minutes ahead of the train down the tracks, so that if anything untoward befell, it would befall them and not Hitler's train.
Similar measures protected Hitler's personal plane against saboteurs. The service personnel were specially selected and guarded. His pilot always took a precautionary test flight before each journey. This meant that a bomb planted on the plane, which could be activated by altitude change, would explode before Hitler boarded. There were further precautions.
Hitler was sitting in a seat with a parachute. The back support contained a parachute. The floor was armor-plated where Hitler sat, so that in case there was anti-aircraft fire, presumably Hitler would be somewhat protected.
But not every aspect of Hitler's life was so heavily protected, according to Rocke-Smich.
For example, if he were in Munich, he had a private apartment in Munich. His housekeeper was Frau Winter. We had the apartment below his. It was a normal apartment building where the people who lived there just went in and out. We didn't check up on anybody. When he dined out, he used to go to the Osteria, a restaurant he had used in the early days. He would go there on the spur of the moment, and we would go there unannounced. The other customers were there. They weren't pushed out. So we went inside. There was a side room reserved for Hitler and his entourage. It was quite private. And that's why we, his bodyguards, were there too.
Dazu hat seine Bodyguard gehabt.
So where was Hitler most vulnerable? There was a major gap in his security, which only those closest to him knew.
As far as I'm concerned, I would say that the Führer's apartment in Berlin, the one in the Old Reich Chancellery, was the least well guarded of all. Apart from at night, when there was a guard in the garden. But on the other hand, you could walk straight in the apartment off the street. It opened directly onto the street, and you could simply walk straight off the street into the building, and there was only one guard. Suppose someone wanted to get to Hitler and had sprayed something in my face so that I became confused and incapable of action. All that person had to do is walk up the 22 steps, and he would have been right in the heart of Hitler's lair. The bedroom, living room and office. And in fact, one could easily have kidnapped Hitler. There was just one guard.
But the enemy in England did not have that inside information and were formulating their own plans to remove Hitler from office. In the heart of London, a highly secretive organization was contemplating Hitler's murder. Created in July 1940, its headquarters were at 64 Baker Street. It was known as SOE, the Special Operations Executive.
Its object was to be, in Churchill's phrase, a ministry of ungentlemanly warfare, and to conduct subversion and sabotage in enemy-occupied territories anywhere in the world. Occasionally, of course, SOE contemplated assassinations. They did have one highly successful operation in France in the autumn of 1943 called Rat Week, in which they bumped off a number of Gestapo officials who were simply shot at fairly close quarters, usually with a silent pistol. Hitler, of course, was a special case. And an operation called Foxy was mounted by SOE, contemplating actually getting at him in his country hideout at Berchtesgaden in South Bavaria and doing him in.
The Foxley plan was to infiltrate a hit team disguised in Nazi uniform into the Berchtesgaden area to kill Hitler in or around his home. One person with a detailed knowledge of the Berghof security and was in charge of the day-to-day running of Hitler's home for 7 years was Herbert Göring.
Also die Sicherheitsmaßnahmen am Berghof.
The security measures at the Berghof, if I compare them to the way things are done nowadays, it really makes me smile. There were practically no security measures at the Berghof. There was absolutely nothing of any significance. When he wasn't there was just one man to patrol around the whole area of the Berghof, and when he was there was nobody because he had his personal bodyguard. Obviously the area was cordoned off. There were barbed wire fences because you had to secure it somehow. I understand that. But Hitler himself paid no regard to it, none at all. Also, when you look at when he was riding around in a car, he would stand up in the car and he wouldn't be wearing a bulletproof vest or anything like that. It was a matter of complete indifference to him.
Absolut keinen Wert drauf gelegt.
The Foxley papers reveal a detailed knowledge of Hitler's daily routine at the Berghof.
When he got up about 11 o'clock, then he would be greeted by Bormann, who'd prepared the files for the day, things for Hitler to become aware of, papers for him to sign. And after the daily administrative duty then of about 2 hours, Hitler would then have lunch, a rather late lunch, entertain his guests. And then he would take his guests on a ritual walk. Every day it was his routine to go for about a 20-minute walk from his home, the Berghof, out to a little tea house that Bormann had built in the direction of Austria.
Und dann ist ganz spontan.
Then he would quite spontaneously get to his feet and go for a walk to the tea house. He made no prior announcement. He would just simply walk off. He just picked up his hat and his walking stick and off he would go. And we went after him, 2 guards. And then the guests would fall in on the walk to the tea house.
Hidden away in the woods on the edge of a cliff overlooking Austria, this is all that remains of Hitler's tea house, the Mooslannerhof, where he would hold court with his captive audience.
He would always have cups of tea, monologuing his way through the afternoon to his guests until he very typically nodded off for half an hour. Everybody was quiet, and then he would walk down quietly to a small parking area, and his large car would take him then back to his home, the Berghof.
The British knew about Hitler's daily walk and planned to kill him on his stroll through the woods when his protection was minimal. Or, if that failed, to launch a bazooka attack on his car as he returned up this road to his home. The Foxley papers are specific about the weapon to be used. A Mauser or similar high-powered sniper's rifle with dum-dum bullets was to be used for the attack on the walk to the tea house. But for the assault on Hitler's car, a British Piat gun, an anti-tank weapon, was recommended, or an American bazooka.
If an assassin had planned to kill Hitler at the Berghof, that would have been no problem at all. There were so many opportunities. When, for example, he walked up and down the covered walkways attached to the Berghof, from there to the edge of the forest, it was only a matter of 80, 90 meters. Somebody could easily have shot him from there. In fine weather, what he would do is walk in the garden at the back. There was a lawn with paving stones leading round it. He would walk around in a trance-like state, totally absorbed. There were strict orders that he could not be disturbed, no matter what. If there was a telephone call, the adjutant could not interrupt him. He would march up and down like this for up to 1.5 hours at an unbelievable speed. Left about turn, right about turn. He was completely switched off. And he used to do some of his typical gestures in an ecstatic state. It was interesting to watch him, at least interesting for me to watch him. I don't know why. I was seeing the real man. He was forging these gigantic plans, and he would stop for a while and then off he would shoot again as if under orders, like a sprinter.
The other major target favored by the Foxley planners was Hitler's train, on which he traveled to Berchtesgaden.
There were plans to snipe him or to fire this bazooka against him when he was either getting in or off his train. The train features again because there were some highly speculative thoughts that they could perhaps poison the water on Hitler's train, and so to introduce a poison that would be quite slow reacting, had no antidote, but would kill anybody who had taken any of this water within a matter of a week or so after it had been ingested.
In SOE's murderous plans, the morality of assassinating Hitler was not a major issue, but the fear of Nazi reprisals following their leader's death was.
When contemplating killing Hitler, the High Command of SOE remembered, of course, a highly successful operation, on the whole, in the summer of 1942, when the Czechoslovaks and SOE, working in combination, had managed to kill Reinhard Heydrich, the Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia. Ghastly reprisals followed. About 5,000 Czechs were assassinated. Two whole villages, Lidice and Lezaci, were both wiped out and all their grown-up inhabitants shot. Most of the children sent away to concentration camps. Even so, SOE was proud of the operation, but again were aware that the reprisal cost for killing Hitler, particularly for failure, would be absolutely ghastly. And this was not something to which they wanted to subject even the German population.
But it was a small group of Germans who were to make the most determined attempt to kill Hitler, irrespective of the consequences. Bendlerblock, Berlin, a wartime headquarters of the Wehrmacht. Germans gather each year to honor some of their greatest war heroes. But the soldiers they remember did not fall on the fields of battle, but died trying to kill their commander-in-chief, Adolf Hitler. As the war progressed, there was growing unease in army ranks at Hitler's conduct in the war, in particular the huge loss of German life on the Russian front. Although resistance elements within the military remained active, they lacked the means and opportunity of getting close enough to Hitler to kill him. Henning von Treschow, a charismatic officer based on the Eastern Front, was the most persistent plotter against Hitler. He gathered around him men with similar spirit. One of them was Freiherr von Boeselager.
Treschow was guided by his conscience, and the pogroms against the Jews in 1938 convinced him that Hitler had to be killed because it was obvious that Hitler could not be removed by democratic means.
Time after time, Treschow's attempts on Hitler's life were thwarted. There was a plan to kill Hitler while on a visit to army headquarters in Smolensk in 1943. He was to die in a hail of bullets while at lunch in the officers' mess, but a senior general vetoed the plan at the last minute. There was a time bomb that Treschow had placed on Hitler's plane, hidden in a Cointreau bottle. It mysteriously failed to go off. There was a weapons exhibition in Berlin when a colleague of Treschow planned to embrace Hitler with a bomb in his pocket. The Führer rushed around the display and left after 2 minutes. Finally, from within the ranks of the resistance stepped a young army colonel with the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Hitler. Klaus von Stauffenberg was one of 3 brothers who had first supported Hitler's military aims and then grew to detest them. But he had one major disadvantage as an assassin.
Stauffenberg was the only officer, the only top-ranking officer who was willing to carry out the assassination attempt himself. If we're honest, he was totally unsuited for the task because he had lost one hand and only had 3 fingers on the other. But he was the only officer who could get to Hitler and was prepared to assassinate him.
He believed a signal must be given to both Germany and the rest of the world that there was another Germany, that there was a Germany and Germans who condemned Hitler's crimes and who were willing to put their lives on the line for it.
His chance came in July 1944 at a meeting with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. His plan was to place a bomb in a briefcase next to Hitler. It was in a side room of his bunker that Stauffenberg helped his adjutant Werner von Haften prime the bomb. Disturbed by an orderly, they managed to set only half of the explosives planned. At the meeting, Stauffenberg placed his briefcase close to Hitler and left shortly afterwards on the pretext of making a phone call. Von Haften was waiting outside with a car to escape to the local airfield and their plane back to Berlin. They were leaving the main security area when the bomb went off. The driver of their car that day was Erich Kretz.
Konnte ich natürlich sehen, dass eine gewaltige
Of course, I could see an enormous cloud caused by an explosion, and fragments of the wooden barracks were flying through the air, and people were running hither and thither. But since I had to concentrate on the road, I wasn't able to pay too much attention to the scene. But when I look back, I was struck by the fact that I noticed no reaction from Colonel Stauffenberg or his adjutant, Lieutenant von Haften.
As Stauffenberg flew back to Berlin to lead the coup, he was convinced that Hitler had died in the devastating explosion. Miraculously, he had survived, protected from the blast by a table leg. He suffered only bruises and pierced eardrums, while 4 others died and several were severely injured. When news of Hitler's survival reached Berlin, support for the coup collapsed, despite Stauffenberg's desperate efforts.
He said on the evening of the 20th of July, facing the failure of the coup, "They all deserted me."
Shortly after midnight on July 20th, 4 of the leading conspirators were arrested, lined up against this wall outside Army headquarters at Bendler Block, and executed by firing squad. Von Haften and Stauffenberg were among them. Hitler's fury at this attempt on his life was all-consuming. 5,000 people were arrested and many tortured. In this courtroom, show trials of those who had conspired against him took place. The People's Court was presided over by the notorious Nazi judge, Roland Freisler. One by one, they were led before him. Those directly connected to the plot and those who had simply expressed opposition to Hitler. Karl Gördler, the former mayor of Leipzig, Adam von Trott of the Kreisau Circle, Ulrich von Hassel, the former German ambassador to Italy. They were allowed no proper defense, and the verdict was a foregone conclusion.
Im Namen des deutschen Volkes, Karl Gördler, Wilhelm Leuschner, Josef Wirmer und Ulrich von Hassel.
The execution block at Plötzensee prison in Berlin, a place of total horror. Through this door, the accused were dragged. They were hung in the cruelest manner, by piano wire from these meat hooks, in order to prolong their death throes. The executions were filmed for Hitler's delectation. But Hitler's vengeance also spread to the families of the accused. At the time of her father's execution, Fay von Hassel was living in Italy with her 2 young sons.
The order came from Berlin that I had to leave Italy with the 2 boys, because there is a law which Hitler used of old times, that the children and grandchildren, everyone, had to be imprisoned. We are called prisoners of kin.
Fay was taken under escort to Innsbruck, where she had to surrender her 2 boys to the SS.
My elder son screamed on top of his voice and moved and pulled with his hand away. He didn't want to go.
Her sons were placed in a children's home and given new identities. Fay was not allowed to know where they were. She spent the next 7 months with other prisoners of kin in a series of concentration camps.
After 3 weeks in Kettelkar, we arrived in Buchenwald. And then I saw some like peasant carriages, these, flat things, and they were full of dead people. Full of dead people.
Fay was fortunate. In May 1945, she was liberated by the U.S. Army along with other prisoners of kin. Her agony was not over. After returning to her home in Italy, she was unable to get back to Germany to look for her sons. It was left to her mother to carry out a frantic search, armed with photographs of the 2 boys. 4 months later, Fay received a telegram.
When I got the telegram, I was near the chapel talking with the gardener. I opened the telegram nervously because I had gotten so many telegrams, always was no good news. Well, I wept and screamed and told the gardener, the children have been found. I ran from the chapel to the gate. I saw the butler with his family, and I told them, the children have been found. The children have been found, and we all wept.
A happy ending for Fay and her family. But how would fortune favor the tyrant as Allied pressure to murder him mounted? At SOE's headquarters in London, the debate continued whether or not to kill Hitler. Opinion was divided.
The establishment has never been fond of assassination as a weapon of war. It very seldom happens that killing a senior person advances the cause that you're trying to advance. Who would have succeeded Hitler? Himmler was a very likely successor because he controlled the secret police and therefore controlled the country and was extremely vain and extremely boastful. He might have enjoyed trying to run Germany. Ghastly results might have followed. Goering, who was the official number 2, was by that time pretty well burnt out with drugs. Some creature like Bormann might have appeared behind the scenes to run somebody like Goering, again with catastrophic results both for the Germans and for the Allies.
Having considered the idea of assassinating Hitler, it was not a great leap forward for SOE to begin to speculate as to whether there were some other Nazis that they might contemplate going after. This becomes Foxley 2, which is a subsidiary series of proposals in which Himmler, Goebbels, Otto Skorzeny, and a couple of generals were actually marked out as a potential target.
SOE knew more about the movements and lifestyle of Goebbels than anybody else. In particular, they knew that he had a country villa north of Berlin, which he retired to from time to time. He travelled usually to and from Berlin to this estate by car. He wasn't well protected. He was just in the car with the driver and one guard. It was an unmarked car. He would have been a possible target for assassination.
With the passage of time, as the war began to conclude, there is actually a feeling, well, there's no point going and killing these people because the conduct of the war is all but over, and we're going to need to interview them and find out what they've been up to.
When the Allied powers could see that they were gaining the upper hand, although there were setbacks for them, as in the submarine war, they were less and less willing to even think about terms, to even think about anything less than total victory.
We never gave up hope of being able to carry out such an operation, but it was generally accepted that the assassination of Hitler from outside was virtually unfeasible. So, of course, as was shown in the 20th of July plot, from the inside, it was a perfectly practical proposition. Whether indeed it was desirable or not, in any case, is open to question.
Killing Hitler might very easily have made a martyr of him. That would have done no good. If you rubbed Hitler out, it would create another stab in the back legend. Lots of people would have said, if only our dear Führer had lived, he would have known how to win the war.
In the last months of the Second World War, it was thought by the Allies that Hitler had set up his headquarters here under this mountain in gigantic headquarters equipped with everything that the Nazis needed to make their last stand. This air raid, this Allied bombing, the last large-scale air raid of the Second World War was staged with the intention of wiping Hitler out here in his cradle of the Nazi Party. The Royal Air Force focused their bombs on the Obersalzberg region. Hitler's home was hammered with some of the 1,232 tons of bombs that were dropped from the sky on that mission in hopes of killing Hitler in his final hiding place here in the Bavarian hills.
But Hitler had left his Berchtesgaden hideaway and was in Berlin, encircled by Russian troops, issuing orders to the remnants of his army from a bunker beneath the wrecked chancellery.
Naja, die Atmosphäre war ein Drama.
The atmosphere was high drama. There was not a single smile to be seen. You could see death lurking in everyone's face. The whole place was a concrete coffin.
Das Ganze war ein Betonsarg.
Anybody but Hitler would have stopped the war and sued for peace after the Germans had been driven back to their own territory. As it was, out of pure bloody mindedness and possibly an inbuilt desire for a Viking funeral of his own, Hitler went on fighting and dragged Germany down with him.
Die mit ihm zu tun hatten, die sagten alle,
those who had to deal with Hitler, they all said that he was mentally with it, 100%. It was only outwardly that he looked very tired, and I can confirm that. We stood face to face, a meter between us. We looked into each other's eyes. He made a little nod of his head and went away again into his room. It was a bunker of death.
Ein Todesbunker war das.
Hitler was hoping for a saving miracle, but his prolongation of the war in the face of inevitable defeat had already cost Germany dearly. Almost 5 million Germans died in the last 9 months of the war, compared with less than 3 million for the rest of the war. If the Foxley Plan had gone ahead, many lives would have been saved.
Saving Allied lives would also have been perceptible. The losses in Bomber Command, which were very severe, the United States Army Air Force, which were also very severe. A lot of sailors were killed, both merchant and serving sailors in the last winter of the war, who might have lived had the war been wound up earlier. Quite apart from the Jews who were being massacred steadily. And the massacre again might have been mitigated by an earlier conclusion to the war, if you could be sure that the war was going to be concluded early by getting rid of Hitler, but you couldn't be sure of it.
And then on April 22nd, Hitler made the statement that he would not leave Berlin, but he would stay in Berlin and die in Berlin, and I know that was on April 22nd. And from then on we thought that something was going to happen, that Hitler was going to take his life very shortly, was going to die. People were speculating whether he would shoot himself or take poison. That's the sort of thing that people were talking about.
Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, with his longtime companion, Eva Braun. They had married the day before in the bunker.
They opened the door, and then I saw Hitler with his head slumped forward, sitting in the armchair, and Eva Braun next to him, with her knees pulled up in a dark blue dress with a white collar, and, well, they were dead. And then they carried the dead bodies upstairs into the garden, through the emergency exit of the bunker into the garden. But I didn't see the burning of the bodies. And that was the end of the Nazi era. I was part of its dissolution, and that was the end, there in the bunker.
During World War II, this was one of the most secret and dangerous places on Earth. In this dense and mosquito-ridden forest in a remote part of Poland, engineers created Hitler's main wartime headquarters, known as Wolfschanze, the Wolf Slayer. It was here that Hitler came closest to death, the target of a daring assassination plot by members of his own military. It was the culmination of a dozen known attempts on his life. This is the story of those heroic individuals who tried to change the course of history. It is also the story, revealed here for the first time, of a top-secret plot hatched in London to kill the most hated man on Earth. For 12 years, Hitler held Germany in an iron grip.
Was einem ganzen Leben Inhalt, Sinn und Zweck gegeben hat.
Hitler promised Germans work, bread, and good order, and had delivered. In return, he received fanatical devotion. But there were those who saw his true intentions and plotted to remove him.
From the moment of Hitler's appointment, the National Socialists made certain that they would never have to relinquish power again. In other words, they established a police state.
The Nazis had secured their power in Germany.
The British government had received several approaches from the German resistance prior to the war, warning them of Hitler's warlike intentions and seeking their help. They were rebuffed.
It was pretty clear that the extent of the Nazi organization was so rigorous that the only organization that would have been competent to destroy the Nazis was, in fact, the German army, the Wehrmacht. And of course, they were on the crest of these military successes.
Hitler's early military successes endeared most of the army to him. His senior generals had particular reason to remain loyal.
Hitler certainly tried to bribe them and to buy them, and I would say with some measure of success. Some received large estates of thousands of acres, and some received enormous gifts of up to 1 million marks on their birthdays or on some more or less contrived occasion, and they accepted these. One can hardly expect people who accept money from Hitler to kill him.
It fell to this man, the least likely of assassins, to make one of the most important attempts on Hitler's life. George Elser was a cabinet maker from the small mountain village of Königsbronn, 100 miles west of Munich. At school, he had been a model pupil. For a short time, he was employed in the local steel works. He showed no interest in politics, Hitler, or the Nazis. His great love was music. He sang in the local choir and played several musical instruments, including the double bass and the zither. 13-year-old Hans Elser, a distant cousin, sang and played alongside him.
Da war ein Klostergebäude, Torbogengebäude, musiziert.
We used to make music in an old monastery. He played double bass, my father played the cello. I played the violin. My violin teacher also joined in. And that's how we developed a close relationship. And my parents were very enthusiastic about Johann Georg Elser, and he became a friend of the family, so to speak. He was very obliging, but modest and retiring.
Aber immer bescheiden, zurückhaltend gewesen.
Elser planned his assassination with military precision. He began to build his bomb with explosives and detonators stolen from this local quarry. In August 1939, he left Königsbronn and took a train to Munich. Renting a room at 94 Türkenstrasse, he spent the day designing and perfecting his bomb. Each evening, he left his lodgings to take supper at the Bürgerbrau beer hall, his chosen assassination site. He knew each November the Nazi Party honored its fallen heroes in a ceremony Hitler was sure to attend. Its climax was Hitler's address to the party faithful at the Bürgerbraukeller.
It was possible for Georg Elser to hide himself.
Mainly by having all the town areas carefully organized with a party member in every block of flats, keeping an eye on exactly what was going on. In every village, there was at least one party narc, probably two, keeping an eye on how people were behaving.
It is a very difficult situation in a dictatorship to be against a dictatorship. What can you do? That's the big question. That's the big question that hangs over the German resistance. Of course, try and kill Hitler, says everybody. But if you cannot do that, what do you do then?
In 1938, in September, when war threatened to break out, the Germans recoiled at the prospect of another war. But they had no way of expressing their dissatisfaction. They could not publish anything, they could not speak out, they could not use the radio, they could not use a free press. There was no free press.
Nonetheless, resistance grew. Freya von Moltke's husband Helmut, a lawyer and aristocrat, formed a secret group that met in this home in Berlin. The Kreisau Circle worked on plans for a new democratic Germany, but were divided on the issue of Hitler's removal from office.
There are all those who said, the quicker he's dead, the better. Think of all the victims that we can save. But Helmut said, to the eyes of the Germans, Hitler must destroy himself. Let Hitler kill himself, so to speak.
The other principal group of opposition to Hitler formed around Karl Gödler, the mayor of Leipzig, who tried to civilize the Nazis by working with them and failed. He believed Hitler should be put on trial.
As a lawyer, he imagined if a trial were to follow Hitler's arrest, then in the course of this trial, all the awful things that had happened under Hitler's regime would be exposed to the German people. And that would free the people from the illusion that Hitler was a great leader.
The first group to plot Hitler's death met in this Berlin building, the headquarters of the Abwehr, Germany's intelligence organization. Their leader was General Hans Oster. He detested Hitler, his treatment of the Jews, and his warlike intentions. In September 1938, he organized a commando group to burst into Hitler's office in Berlin and murder him. It was an audacious plan.
It was an enormous step to take. You just have to appreciate that some people said, I just can't do it. On top of that, there was a question of murder, which was a problem for everybody. But as a Christian, you know that you live by forgiveness, and we all commit sins in the course of our lives. And my father knew that, and was always prepared to act, even if it meant murder.
The Oster plan collapsed when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain came to Munich in late September 1938 and signed an accord guaranteeing, it seemed, peace in Europe. Hitler was to swiftly break that agreement, but for Oster and his group, their opportunity to kill Hitler had withered with the signing of the peace accord. In London, the British